Chapter 7: The Blockchain of Being. If we can capture in our mind's eye the I am that I am, who stands outside his creation and grants a particular human seed line, your seed after you, a unique covenant, then we can also capture an essential aspect of the design and purpose, i.e., logos of God, the reality of being. Erick Voegelin, the great 20th century philosopher, refers to being as a philosophical concept that describes the fundamental structure and order of the world. Following the classic Greeks, Voegelin defines being not as an object, but a context of order in which are placed all experienced complexes of reality. In this way, the great hierarchy of being consists of four partners: God, man, world, and society. The individual man, as part of this whole, finds his own humanity in his participatory experiences and relations with the other partners of the hierarchy, and most especially in his relation to God and the reality of being. In Seeing Through the Singularity, Part 1, we considered God's covenant with man from the perspective of biopolitics and biological blockchains. In Part 2, we will consider blockchains within or in relation to the reality of being. To this end, we begin with Erick Voegelin's work, which by the 1940s became pregnant with the germ of an explosive revelation, namely that spiritual regeneration is the central problem of the age, especially in the West. Voegelin identifies a crisis of the spirit that results from the influence of what he calls Gnosticism, which he defines as the movement predicated upon the assumption that through human knowledge, man has it within his capacity to fulfill himself within history. According to Voegelin, the essence of Gnostic politics must be interpreted as a spiritual sickness, as a gnosis in Plato's sense of the term, a disturbance in the life of the spirit as distinct from mental illness in the sense of psychopathology. John O. East elaborates upon the political implications. Gnosticism is seen in its most virulent form in modern totalitarianism, fascism, and communism. The totalitarian mind lusts for total control of all facets of human life, thought, and behavior. Its vision is boundless, and its alleged wisdom knows no limit. The totalitarian proclaims to have unraveled the mystery of history, and he proceeds to ensconce himself as the self-appointed elite who will direct mankind in the creation of an instant worldly paradise. Not surprising, an insatiable pride and a fascination for violence are its hallmarks. To Voegelin, totalitarianism is the ultimate in the crisis of the spirit of the modern age. In part one, we identified within discursive biopolitics the same totalitarian impulse within the germ of modern democracy. See Giorgio Agamben. In part two, we consider the Gnostic impulse that manifests totalitarianism along with the Promethean impulse that manifests technological singularity. The great hierarchy of being consists of four partners: God, man, world, and society. God's unique covenant with a unique seed line, i.e., blockchain, operates within this grand design and purpose, i.e., logos. Here, notes Voegelin, is not a realm of darkness, to be sure. It is darkened by the all too human factor of the fall, but it is ennobled again by the incarnation of God as the locus of fulfilled humanity within the limitations of creaturely being. Voegelin, no Christian apologist, however, recognized that reality of being provides an infinite potential for hope in the fact that Western civilization contains as a positive force, however diluted and weak it might have become, the Christian idea of the singularity and spiritual dignity of the human soul. In sum, Christianity discovered the faith that saves man from the death of sin and lets him enter as a new man into the life of the Spirit. Voegelin explains further that within God's seed line, i.e., blockchain, I am no longer a mere link in the chain of generations, but the spiritual center. The truth of Christianity, says Voegelin, breaks with the rhythm of existence beyond temporal successes into the supernatural destiny of man, the perfection through grace in the beyond. Man and mankind now have fulfillment, but it lies beyond nature. His astonishing conclusion: the life of the Spirit is the source of order in man and society. In part one, we concluded with the assertion that the very nature of technology limits it from reversing the nature of man, i.e., death, or subduing the reality of being. Nevertheless, the singularity pursuit continues, largely within the world of the mind, with the perceptions that define technology and the reality of being. In part two, we explore how Gnosticism informs the politics of technological singularity as it shapes perceptions regarding the limits of science and the reality of being. Remember, God put enmity between two seed lines, i.e., blockchains. In this manner, Voegelin puts in counter-distinction to God's blockchain of being an ancient and competing blockchain of gnosis that finds its modern philosophical and political expression in Friedrich Hegel. Within this blockchain, quote, every single man is but a blind link in the chain of absolute necessity by which the world builds itself forth. The single man can elevate himself to dominance over an appreciable length of this chain only if he knows the direction, which is the great necessity, i.e., Geist of history. Wants to move, and if he learns from this knowledge to pronounce the magic words, die Zuberot, that will evoke its shape, Gestalt. Voegelin insists that Hegel's Geist, spirit of history, operates outside the reality of being. Instead, Hegel's view of history operates like a machine that must end so a new age can begin. Hegel says the machine is moving toward the point in history from which man can grant grace to himself, to save himself, to perfect his condition without the salvific grace of God, the point of technological singularity. In part two, we consider the magic words that bring about the point in history, the technological singularity. Indeed, we will explore the magic behind the sorcerer's magic words as we wrestle with the enigmatic ghost in the machine. In light of such expectations, we need to remember that magic words in themselves do not evoke an actual creative act. Rather, it is the invocation of appearances, of illusions. Magic words do not have the power to actually change the structure of being, of reality, but only the way the sorcerer wants us to see it. If he is successful, then we are grievously misled. The sorcerer's ability to bend the mind I liken to Plato when he spoke, "Whatever deceives men seems to produce a magical enchantment." Likewise, Eros is an awe-inspiring magician, sorcerer, and sophist. Protagoras draws them from each of the cities through which he passes, enchanting them with his voice, just like Orpheus, and they follow his voice spellbound. But there was a certain man called Simon, which before time in the same city used sorcery, and bewitched the people of Samaria, giving out that himself was some great one. Hegel's work was not only a continuation of the tradition of Gnostic and Hermetic scholarship, but also a contribution to an ongoing project in the history of ideas pioneered by the long list of writers you see before you. These scholars argue that Gnostic Kabbalistic Hermeticism has influenced such mainstream rationalist thinkers as Bacon, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and Newton, and has played a hitherto unappreciated role in the formation of the central ideas and ambitions of modern philosophy and science, particularly the modern project of the progressive scientific investigation and technological mastery of nature. According to Voegelin, Hegel's monumental work, Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, embedded the Gnostic, Kabbalist, Hermetic tradition within the philosophy and politics of the current age. Notably, Phenomenology served as a grimoire, a magician's book of spells and incantations, which takes as its main goal the transformation of the reality of being through the transformation of philosophy, the love of knowledge, into the final complete possession of real knowledge, by means of his system of absolute science. Voegelin notes, no modern propaganda minister could have devised a more harmless sounding, persuasively progressivist phrase as a screen for the enormity transacted behind it. Charles Baudelaire, the famed 19th century French scholar, further explains how the phenomenology attempts to overturn the reality of being as it admits no reality but consciousness. Yet, since consciousness must be a somebody's consciousness of something, and neither God nor man is admitted as somebody or something, the consciousness must be a consciousness of itself. Its absolute reality is, therefore, properly identified as the identity of identity and non identity. The substance becomes the subject, and the subject the substance, in the process of a consciousness that is eminent to itself. The reader would justly ask what a consciousness that is nobody's consciousness could possibly be. End quote. The phenomenology further attempts to overturn the reality of being through the dialectic science. In part one, we identified the 19th century Promethean impulse to combine Darwinian theory and modern technology to achieve political utopia and human apotheosis. In part two, we will consider how the phenomenology extends the Promethean impulse of the 19th century by means of Hegel's teleological, goal-directed, eschatological account of human history, i.e., dialectic science. Under the aegis of Darwinism, the Promethean impulse, informed by the phenomenology, will culminate in the utopian world systems that await the Marxian total man or Nietzschean last man. Voegelin concludes, all under a United Nations that would subdue the Gnostic crisis of Western and Westernized civilizations by legal procedures, and that desires to build the divine kingdom of peace on earth. In part one, we also identified within discursive biopolitics the Promethean Darwinian impulse toward human purification, what Michael Foucault labeled under secrets of empire, or what Giorgio Agamben called the hidden matrix of modern politics. In part two, we will consider the significance of purification within the discourse of dialectic science, specifically how dialectic science has been directed toward the creation of a divine earthly kingdom. More specifically, we will consider the creation of earthly Jerusalem and why it requires the elimination of God's seed line, the blockchain of being, as a Gnostic, Kabbalistic, Hermetic act of purification. In order to cleanse the outside cause, God and his blockchain must die, so man then liberated is prepared for self sanctification and self salvation. In Hegel's phenomenology, the sorcerer operates the dialectic science and directs man inexorably toward the goal of self salvation, all the time rejecting the idea of an established order to the universe, i.e., logos. Indeed, he rejects any order that has an origin outside human consciousness, the very realm the sorcerer works to manipulate. The sorcerer also directs human consciousness and the destiny of man through acolytes of the phenomenology. Karl Marx. Philosophy makes no secret of it. The confession of Prometheus, in a word, I hate all the gods, is its own confession, its own verdict against all gods, heavenly and earthly, who do not acknowledge human self consciousness as the supreme deity. Catherine Haley's, in the post human, there are no essential differences or absolute demarcations between bodily existence and computer simulation, cybernetic mechanisms and biological organisms, robot technology and human goals. End quote. Voegelin draws our attention here not only to the dialectic science that undergirds the techno political projects shared by the left, right, and center. He boldly draws our attention to the sorcery embedded within the dialectic science that employs the magic word and the magic force, Zuberot and Zuberkraft, respectively. Consider again the phenomenology. Every single man is but a blind link in the chain of absolute necessity by which the world builds itself forth. The single man can elevate himself to dominance over an appreciable length of this chain only if he knows the direction in which the great necessity, i.e., Geist of history, wants to move, and if he learns from this knowledge to pronounce the magic words, Zuberot, that will evoke its shape, Gestalt. Zeit can be translated as mind or spirit. In the cultural sense, the spirit of the age, i.e., Zeitgeist. Gestalt, or plural, gestalten, means the present historical configuration of events as the Geist inexorably moves toward the fulfillment of its final absolute necessity, at which point, in its final gestalt, the complete identity of absolute self and absolute idea, world history ends, and a new age of man, standing alone, begins. Because man is now alone, Hegel says we arrive at a point in history where man can grant grace to himself, to save himself, to perfect the human condition without the salvific grace of God. Yet this capital M, man, in relation to the reality of being, quote, has become nothing. He has no reality of his own. He is a blind particle in a process of the world which has the monopoly of the real reality and the real meaning. Note, it is not the world that has meaning, only the process has meaning. In order to raise himself from nothing to something, the blind particle must become a seeing particle. But even if the particle has gained sight, it sees nothing but the direction in which the process is moving. And yet, to Hegel, something important has been gained. The nothing that has raised itself to a something has become, if not man, at least a sorcerer who can evoke, if not the reality of history, at least its shape, i.e., Geist. The politics of singularity. God is God only so far as he knows himself. His self knowledge is, further, a self consciousness in man's knowledge of God, which proceeds to man's self knowledge in God. The singularity, however defined, exists in a post human world. Man will have reached salvation and perfection either through grace from beyond or through gnosis, which, as Hegel just stated, proceeds from man's self knowledge in God. According to Voegelin, The Gnostic path to self-salvation, i.e., singularity, requires a particular mode of political action. Gnostic politics will consist in radical disruption of the old world. The coercive institutions of the old world, the organized power of the state and bureaucracy would have to be eliminated. Voegelin continues. And to what this perfected life is supposed to look like, nothing at all is said, because we ourselves still belong to the generation of destruction. We can help the world toward perfection by the annihilation of the old world. But the knowledge of the new life is that it is to be created for the generation liberated by our action. Because technological singularity assumes the Gnostic mode of politics, we will see permanent war against people and institutions, ultimately against the reality of being. Since the concrete order of reality must be overcome through the permanent revolution of gnosis, there will exist what Voegelin called a cancerous ulcer in the body of reality. It is the death of a civilization if it is not stopped by stronger formative forces. End quote. Because technological singularity requires a politics of faith in redemption through action, what the National Socialist Gnostics call the will that does not see, we will see revolutionary action swelling from the promise of transfigured man, what the communist called the total man. For the mass engendering of the communist consciousness, a transmutation of human beings in the mass is necessary. An alteration such as can only be caused by the experience of revolution. Thus, revolution is necessary not only for overturning the dominant classes, but above all for overthrowing class, reach the point where it gets rid of the old filth. In this way, Nazi professor of constitutional law, Carl Schmitt, noted on the occasion of his examining the brutality of the regime, the identical formula as in Marx: out with the filth. In this way, Catherine Hayles makes it abundantly clear the post-human condition is man's transformation, i.e., out with the filth, into a machine. In short, the politics of singularity must overthrow the reality of being by getting rid of the old filth, the blockchain of being.